Okay, welcome back. That was a short pause. Okay, so allow me to just reiterate what I've already said. I think it is important, so let's listen again. So, welcome to this talk. I'm really happy to see all of you here today to listen to what I have to share. So, welcome to this talk about does the future need devs? This is based on some research I did as part of my doctoral study, which is mainly focused on Industry 4. Um, that I presented at a conference on a new idea originating from Japan a few years back called Society 5. But don't worry, this is much less boring than any form of academic study. So please join me on this journey. So then, for those of you that might again be nervous for seeing the title again, um, do not worry. Please enjoy me on this journey. You can relax. There will still be jobs. But why am I inviting you to a talk on does the future need us, yet I immediately tell you there will still be jobs? Well, because at any point we may become irrelevant. Imagine a scenario where your favorite programming language could at any point stop being relevant, stop being used. What if the framework that you are good at or the framework that your expertise lies in is no longer relevant for some odd reason? We don't think about these things because we seem it like really unlikely to happen, right? But I think the past 2 years have showed us that anything is indeed possible. So then, programmers. The world out there and many businesses does differentiate between software engineers, software developers, regular developers, whatever you want to call them. From my perspective, if you turn caffeine into code, you are a developer. So I hope that count goes for all of us. I know it goes for me for sure. But the first question that you might ask is, okay, but why developers? Why spend so much time and effort to try and answer this question? Well, let me show you. If you take a look at this picture, you see the physical world at the bottom. This could mean like factories, homes, anything really, hospitals, schools, anything. And then at the top, you see the cyberspace, which is where all the nice things we like to work with live, where our applications gets deployed, referring back to Tony's talk, cloud and this massive interconnectivity. Um, so to describe this cyber physical system, allow me to give you an example. So imagine we have a factory that packages fruit, okay? At some point, there should be some form of quality control that checks if the fruit is of the right quality to be packaged and shipped. So how would this quality control look like? Well, perhaps it could look like a camera. So we have some form of sensing. So there could be a camera that detects the fruit and then sends that sensing information to cyberspace. The program running in cyberspace would then have the ability to recognize or understand what that information means. From there on, that program can then do some form of analysis, maybe a bit of prediction, and give back a plan, which is then given back to the factory in the form of control. This control could be perhaps a jet of air that blasts the fruit off the conveyor belt. But the whole purpose of this cyber physical interaction is value creation. And the reason this is so important is that we as devs, we work and operate square in the cyberspace. It is our responsibility to create the software, the applications, the systems that receives the information, does something with it, and then sends back that form of control to the physical space. We can also touch on this idea of Industry 4, which has also been around for some time. It was first formalized in 2011 in a conference in Germany. And it is really marked by the fast changing pace of technology. The word disruptive technology is really associated with this idea of Industry 4. Technology is changing how we live, changing how we move, changing how business works. Some of these things, like we already mentioned, is the cyber physical interconnection, Internet of Things, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, and then as well new ways that emerges in which, like I said, we live, businesses work, and anything. And if we look at the evolution of the four industrial revolutions, we can see that the fourth industrial revolution, the focus is really on this intense automation, smart factory, all these ideas. And again, in the fourth industrial revolution, a prevalent idea is this idea of becoming irrelevant. Most scholars agree that if you are unable as an organization or as an individual to adapt to the fast changing pace of technologies, you do run the risk of becoming irrelevant. Moving on from that, there is this interesting idea that came from Andrei Karpathy in 2017. He wrote an article about this idea. He was the then head of AI Tesla, and he said that he foresees a future where software engineering fundamentally changes. So currently, in his view, we are in the software 1.0 space. So in this space, we write some code, it gets compiled, gets deployed, and it just runs there like that. Sorry. And then in the software 2.0 space, which he predicts is the future, we would rather than providing the input data and the program code, in essence, we as software engineers would be focused on creating the input data as well as the training data, which would be fed in to some machine learning algorithm, and that algorithm will then take over, will conduct the program like we discussed. It will receive some form of information. So this is his view of the future. To sort of take a look, get an idea of the feasibility of this, the Google engineers went ahead. So if you have Gmail, I think most of you should have seen this before. When you get a plane ticket or a concert ticket or anything like that, Gmail very nicely extracts that information for you. So what the Google engineers did to prove the feasibility of this idea of software 2.0, they rewrote that piece of code to use the principles of software 2.0. Basically, they created some form of data, some data set, trained a neural network, and then see how it went. This new idea of software 2.0 obviously has its own pros and its own cons. There is a lot of noise around it, if I can state it like that. However, there's not really much feasibility in it. So don't worry. And in any case, if AI were to replace us, we would probably go lost, right? Because someone has to create the AI. So that's good as well. Okay. Whenever we work with data, which we'll get to just now, on this journey of trying to answer our question. So just a reminder, we are still on a journey to answer our question of, does the future need devs? Okay. So on this journey, we will get to a point where we'll gather and analyze some data. Whenever we work with data, whenever we need to gather it and analyze it, we need to also create the window or the perspective through which we will view it. So like this window, it gives us a clear view or certain perspective of that lake or the ocean. I can't really decide. So too, we need to define the window that will give us the right perspective of our data. Software engineering, like this office, has very much gone unregulated with respect to the other engineering disciplines. Every team, every company very much, I want to say, does what they like. There's not really some form of overall governance or overall measurement or idea of what software engineering is. So to formalize this idea, the IEEE started a panel to discuss and define, okay, but what is software engineering? So as you saw in Tony's talk, the IEEE is an actual organization. So the IEEE is the world's largest technical professional organization dedicated to advancing technology. They are over 409,000 members in over 160 countries, so really big influence, being worldwide. And then lastly, they inspire members, members inspire a global community through its highly cited publications, conferences, technology standards, etc., etc. So I do think if there is any organization that wants to attempt to define what software engineering is, I think it is this, guys. They do have the qualifications. So what they try to do is they try to define what software engineering is based on 5 key outcomes. The first being the promotion of a consistent view, which gets us back to the picture of the office, to ensure that wherever as software engineers we move, the idea behind software engineering is consistent. The second thing they wanted to achieve was they wanted to create a depiction of the contents of software engineering. In other words, they wanted to define what is and what is not software engineering. Thirdly, they wanted to ensure access to our domain. Historically, software engineering is difficult to get into. It is a highly skilled job, but also you need exposure and technology to enable you. You can probably write code in the sand if you want to, but it's not going to compile. And then They wanted to provide a foundation for curriculum development. This is both for furthering our studies as already qualified software engineers, already in our positions that we are in, but also to define a path which new people that wants to access this domain can then follow. And lastly, they wanted to scope and clarify the position of software engineering with respect to other disciplines. So very often in I'm not so sure about all the projects in BBD, but software engineering works very closely with other engineering disciplines such as chemical or mechanical engineering. So they really wanted to try and scope that as well. So what they came up with is called the software engineering body of knowledge. What this looks like is that it consists of 4 domains: software foundations, management, development, and professional practices. And across the 4 domains, 15 key skill areas were identified. So you don't have to worry about this too much now. We'll get back to this later. But what I do need you to remember, and what this is important for, is that this is the window through which we will view our data when we get there later on. So this is going to create the perspective we need to understand the data that we will be gathering. Okay, so then, to answer our question of what does the future need devs, we first need to understand software engineering. Software engineering, like this road, has come a long way, many ups and downs, and from where we are now, we can then determine where we will go forward. So first, by understanding where we come from, we can then determine where we are going. So the question now is, how do we search and analyze data? How do we find data to use to help us answer our question? So at the back of your minds, you must continuously keep in mind that we are trying to answer a specific question. So we will now go through the journey of searching and analyzing this data. So what does this process look like? Well, if you think about it, it starts with data, right? So we first have to identify data, where we are going to get it, what it is, etc. I heard it lives in lakes. Don't know about you guys, but I've yet to find such a lake. But we have to identify a data source because not everything that we need, example data out there, is relevant. So we then need to create some relevance in this data by either maybe adding or excluding, because we can download the zip of the entire Wikipedia, but not every page in that will help us to answer the question that we are sitting with now. Once we have sort of fine-tuned the data, we get to knowledge. So knowledge is the process of starting to create and group ideas within the information. So maybe to see things that belong together, things that that work together, and then from there on, we can start identifying and creating some insight. This is the part where the connections we made and the groupings we made can start to give us an idea of the answer to our question. And then lastly, we can then answer our question. In essence, we can then create the wisdom needed to answer our question. So how can we apply this process to our own specific needs? So if you remember, we are still on a journey to answer this question. Well, first we need to identify the proper source for our data. So the proper source for our data is, I chose Google Scholar. Google Scholar, generally articles and publications on it is peer reviewed, meaning that it is of a certain quality. And we can generally assume what is captured in it is to a certain extent research thorough and then approved by scholars as well. So it's a good source to start. What we now need to do is, again, it's back to this idea that the entirety of Google Scholar cannot be used to answer our question. We first need to filter through all the data that is within Google Scholar to get what we need. So that's our information. How we do this is simply by search. So in this case, the word keywords that I used in Google Scholar was the future of work skills for software engineers, which is how we are going to answer our question. The information that this gives us can now further be refined by doing something what we call an inclusion and exclusion criteria. So what this looks like is an exclusion criteria, for instance, could be data points that is in a foreign language. So although the data point can contribute valuable information to our ability to answer our question, because it's in a foreign language, it's generally not worth it to try and translate it and then make sense of the translated version. I think all of us have some experience with Google Translate. So we don't want our opinion or our answer to be misinformed by a mistranslation. What an inclusion criteria could look like is that when we read through a paper, we can, for instance, see that they reference a different paper that looks like it can also really have information and we need it. We can then include that paper in our information. Now that we have gone through that, and we have our information, we can now go through the process of refining and extracting it, which is the processes of knowledge and insight. What this looks like is you thoroughly work through each of the papers and you extract only the information that is valuable to your question. What I mean by that is that the entire paper has its own goal in mind. So every paper written by anyone, in fact, has its own goal in mind. So in some sections of the paper, it might touch on ideas and facts that is valuable to the question that we are trying to answer. But very rarely the entire paper is valuable in its entirety. So therefore, we need to work through all of these papers and get the idea or get the information that we need. We only extract what we need. We can then take that extracted information and start refining it, start to see patterns emerging, start to see groupings emerging. And then lastly, we can start to create the knowledge. So this involves processes like grouping ideas, similar ideas together, identifying patterns, which you'll see a bit later on. There are some patterns we identify, there are some groupings. But this process that we just went through, this counts for the data we need to determine where we come from as software engineers and where we are right now. We can follow the exact same process to determine where we are going forward. The difference is we need a different data sample. So for the data sample I chose to help us determine where we are going, I chose what we refer to generally as popular press articles. So these are general publications made in journals and stuff like the Harvard Business Review. And it's generally accepted as done by someone of a certain level of expertise and reviewed, not to the extent of academic papers, but we can generally accept that what is written in it is a viewpoint of the broader community. So using the same process of extracting information, refinement and extraction, and then knowledge, we can arrive at what the future could possibly hold for us as software engineers. So now that we have gone through the process of trying to figure out the data and working through the process of getting that and connecting the dots and all those nice things, we now arrive at the fun part. So this is the fun part of taking a look at the results we got. So very interesting right up front. What is evident in the data is that our profession is largely divided into 3 eras. So before I continue, please don't storm me right now. It doesn't mean that between 2003 and 2004, something major happened. We all know that only happened from 1999 to 2000, right? But this does not imply a hard cutoff date or a hard transition. This is merely a rough estimate, right? Which is shown in the data. So these 3 eras are vastly distinct and each has its own ideas that it brings to software engineering. So firstly, from up to 2003, the forming of the first principles, ideas, and languages was the primary focus of the software engineering profession. So in this era, our profession was quite young. Not much had really gone on it. Everyone was doing Java. No, nothing interesting at all. But we see quite a few interesting things. We see the idea of object-oriented programming already greatly being part of this, with the major languages listed there already, quite old. C++ already quite old at that stage. So very much the ideas we use today as software engineers has already been established way back up to 2003. Moving on to the next era, we see a very interesting thing. So if you remember back to Industry 4, we said that the idea was formalized around 2007. However, the idea or the effect of it has already filtered at that point, filtered through to various disciplines. And one discipline where we felt that was in our discipline as software engineering. But what's interesting in this era, the focus was twofold. So firstly, tooling started to develop with stuff like Git coming in 2005. So in this era, a big focus on tooling, tool sets, tool chains, all those nice words we throw around, but we don't actually know what it does because everyone just uses npm install anyway. But we see tools being developed. And secondly, we see hardware and the platforms being developed. So I have AWS and the first iPhone way back in 2007. Can you believe that? But really the first sort of indication of this idea of Industry 4, we start to see it in the tooling and then as well in the hardware and the platforms that we use with AWS starting their first service in 2006. Moving on to the third era, and this is where we really see the establishment of modern software engineering starting. This is where we see what we experience today as software engineers, what we experience today starting with all our favorite JavaScript frameworks, starting React 2013, Angular 2016, and then Flutter, which, as you all know, enables rapid app development in 2018. But this required the hardware and the platforms and those things to be in place. Imagine trying to write any Angular app without having the right builders, having to set up your builders and everything manually, like if you write a C program. But it's so easy these days with everything coming pre-configured. But in a previous era, those things had to happen. Thought had to go into those things. Okay. So what we can now do is we can look at the individual skills of software engineers identified in each era. For the first era, very interestingly enough, the main focus of software engineers in this era was cognitive skills. With 7 cognitive skills identified, I just gave some examples there for you. Only 1 volitional skill. So just to clarify, volitional skill is something that you do of your own free will. And then lastly, 1 motivational skill. So in this era of software engineering, focus was very much centered around our cognitive ability. In other words, our raw skills, to sit in a dinky basement and write some code, basically. Moving on to the second era, we see a great jump. So suddenly in this era, more thought went into what the software engineering profession is. So while I speak, just for your context, the N implies a new skill, which is new in this era. A plus indicates that the skill was there in the previous era, but it was refined in this era. So we see cognitive skills increasing by 4 with ideas such as technical skills, enterprise software solutions, more concrete ideas forming. Motivational skills up from 1 to 6, skills like self-learning, de-skilling, upskilling, which if you think about it is so part of what we do already without having someone tell us that we need this. And then volitional skills up 5, willing to accept challenges, and then new skills got added. What these skills imply is firstly, thought went into what software engineers is. We can see the software engineering community starting to develop better ideas of what it means to be a software engineer. And secondly, we see that much more weight, if I can study it like that, much more requirements was added to what a software engineer is, meaning that he's moving away from this idea we have of the guy sitting in a basement, in his mom's basement, writing code on an old computer. It's moving way towards, we'll see emotional intelligence project management in a knowledge skill, meaning that we as software developers, to a certain extent, is responsible for managing our own work, right? We all know with sprints and stuff, we have the ability to, well, it's required from us rather, to manage our own progress and our own work. Right, I think I just need some water. Thanks. Moving on to the last era, we see interesting things once again. Cognitive skills going up only 1. Motivational skills just being refined, more ideas being added, and then the same for the other skills. What this shows us is that at this point, the idea of software engineering as a profession was very well fleshed out. The general community had an idea of what we are, what our goal is, and what we are trying to achieve. But what's interesting in this era is the refinement. So skills got a little bit more refinement. We don't see really new skills being added, but ideas were refined. And we'll see this trend going on throughout the rest of our discussion. We'll see this trend going on, this idea of adding skills, but then also refining ideas previously established. So then just a reminder to keep in mind that this is the window, if you remember from the lake, no, not the data lake, just the lake, that this is the window through which we will view our results. So we've went through the process of gathering data. We have looked at some of the initial results, but now we can frame those results within our window. And what we arrive at is called the future of work skills for software engineers and developers. So that's okay. You don't have to read anything right now. We are going to dive into it. What I just want to draw your attention to is the 3 eras on the left, your left. You see the 3 arrows in blue, and then of course you'll see the 4 domains or 4 outcomes of the software engineering body of knowledge. Okay, let's delve into this. Oh, and then before I forget, in orange, you will see the future skills that was identified, also being added at the right, in the right columns. Okay, let's go. So under software foundations, again, like I've mentioned, we see this idea of increase and then refinement. But what's interesting in software foundations, the future skills is all new skills. It's all new stuff. We are looking at ideas like AI, cloud, blockchain, which is all ideas we are familiar with to a certain extent, right? But in this case, for software foundations, the data from the future skills really doesn't indicate some sort of refinement of ideas, rather indicates an add-on of new skills and new abilities that we as software engineers should acquire. Moving on to software management, we don't see very movement in this space. This shows us that by the time of the 3rd era ending in 2021, we have a very good idea of what it means for a software engineer to also have certain software management skills. We look at things like debugging, code review, code inspection, continuous inspection, which I'm sure are things all of us are quite familiar with in our day-to-day programs. Interestingly enough, in this area of software management, also no future skills were identified. This can again point towards the fact that at this point, the idea of the software management aspect of software engineering was very much formalized, very much complete, if I can state it like that. Moving on to software development, we see the same trend, increase in skills. But what's interesting on the software development, the future skills, rather than being additional to previously identified skills, is refinements of. For instance, if you take a look at security identified in the 3rd era, future skills deems that future skills says, but no, the focus will more move towards cybersecurity. The same with continuous architecting will more transition towards continuous integration and development. So specifically in this domain, we see the future really refining ideas that is already present. Okay, almost done. Last one, we see this idea of software professional practices. And again, from the bad out, a ton of skills. Things, again, if you just take a moment to think about, is things we already do. Time management, self-driven, self-learning, adaptability, proactive, willing to accept challenges. I think everyone that works at BBD is willing to accept a challenge. That goes without saying. If I look at what some of our clients want, sometimes the challenge is, but it's there. And then the new skills also adding more ideas towards the professional practice aspect of software engineering. So now we've went through a ton of information. I hope everyone is still awake. You look awake. Okay. That's good. So now we went through a ton of information. For the astute listener, you would have seen that all of us now sort of divide into 3 categories, okay? Firstly, you have been in software engineering for a while, right? For a long time, but you have continuously stayed ahead, you have worked, and you are sort of up to date with all the new skills. you are happy. Then the second group of people could be people that are in software engineering for quite a while, but you have not adapted. You are not happy. And then lastly, there is the new incoming group of software engineers, which could very well be versed skillfully in future skills maybe and the latest skills in the third epoch, and but not really have any knowledge of previous epochs. You have a problem as well, but don't worry. So now the question is, what can we do with this? Okay, so I've given you a bunch of information. We've looked at charts and graphs and all the cool things, but what can we actually do with this? Well, I have good news for you. We can actually do something with this. If we take this graph that we have, or the framework, if I can state it like that, what we can now do is we can take this framework and we can go through each and every one of the skills. And to each of those skills, we can assign a scale, saying that 1, I have very low proficiency, up to 5, I have exceptional proficiency. And then going through that diagram, each of us can then rate ourselves on each of the skills to get an idea of where we stand. The resulting graph would look something like that. So then, based on that, it shows us a few things. Firstly, in order to understand where we are going, we need to understand where we come from, right? So where we are right now. So the first thing this graph will show us is that as a software engineer, what am I good at the moment and where do I lack with context to our framework? So what this shows us then is that, for instance, the person that filled this in needs to invest some time in their software foundations. Okay, so they need to spend some time skilling up on the software foundations. The second thing is that this shows us, which I believe ties in really well with what BBD is doing at the moment, it shows us how to structure our learning. So as we're all aware, BBD is really pushing and giving us ample opportunities to learn and to grow. So this can help us structure that, because I'm sure like many of you, like many of you, have looked at a bunch of courses, not really sure what to do, because you're afraid that once you're done with the course, it's not relevant anymore. Or the framework was upgraded to the new major version, everything you know is now redundant, right? Which is a legit fear, considering we're getting new JavaScript frameworks every week. So there is definitely a reason and a motive to structure our learning correctly. And I do believe this can guide us in that aspect as well. So now that we have worked through this whole process, we have looked at all these ideas, I think we are now finally ready to answer our question that we started with. So, does the future need developers? I think the short answer is yes. But we have to also understand that the future might not need developers as we are now. There will always be developer jobs, I believe. There will always be software engineering jobs. The question that we have to ask ourselves today is, am I equipped to fulfill the software engineering job of the future? Because if you think back to the beginning of this talk, there is always the possibility of becoming irrelevant. And it can happen so quickly. At the moment's notice, some fancy library or thing that we depend on can be deprecated, something can change, anything is possible. But I think the problem is we don't think about these things because we, to an extent, feel foolproof. Everyone needs software engineers, developers is all the hype now. When COVID struck, we had so much work because everyone wanted software solutions, but we too are susceptible to becoming irrelevant. So if you remember only one thing from today, is that simply sitting in the corner, writing code day to day might not be enough for the software engineer of the future. There might come a time where more is required of us than what we are capable of right now. Thank you. Okay. I see we have some time left. Is there questions? Okay, let's start this side. Yes. Yes. So de-skilling and reskilling. So very often we can arrive at the point where a skill we have now is no longer relevant or no longer suitable. And we would have to unlearn that to relearn something in its place. For example, if you play golf, I don't know who plays golf in here. If your swing is bad, it's very often not a measure of just changing it. You have to unlearn the bad habits you've already learned. Does that help? Yes. Any other questions? Yes. Oh, there's questions online.
Cool. So in terms of developers and the just pure amount of skills you've got up there,
Yes.
Just your thoughts in terms of your research about, are those skills becoming too much for one person to master or know? You know, in 2003, you didn't need to know as much, or so many
Yes.
technologies. What's your findings in just the sheer amount of skills developers
Okay.
need to know these days?
Yeah. Okay, cool. Interesting question. So firstly, what is very nice, most of those skills are intrinsic, meaning that we do them without thinking. Luckily, you don't need to really go study how to, how to work hard. You just need to do it, right? What is the problem, though, is the vast majority of, if you remember back to cognitive skills, which is very much related to software foundations, there is the major problem because there's no way you can master all of those. I would suggest to be aware of them, to know of them, so that when someone says, hey, have you heard about this new AI thing? You're like, okay, cool, yeah, I know about it. But I don't think it's possible to actually be highly skilled in all of them, which for any developer is a good and a bad thing. Good because, yes, you specialize. Bad because your speciality could become irrelevant.
It's on. I think I've got both a question and a comment.
Yes.
My observation was that we're very much talking about an end state, a blue sky scenario, right?
Yes.
Where we're moving away from the traditional role at the moment and then ending up in this space where we've got machine learning and we've got all of these advanced technologies. Now, there has to be this transition in between the two, right? And I very much see that in, well, over the last couple of years in that ESB space where, you have the ability to integrate all of these solutions together, but then also getting to a point in time where a single individual are going to be performing a number of functions, call it multi-threading on a processor. You've got a number of cores. You are a business analyst, a systems analyst, perhaps a developer and a tester at the same time, because all of these skills are becoming available to you. You might be able to elicit the requirement from the client. You might be able to then build your own service that pulls from all of these technologies within the firm and then provide you with the right output. And in the end, perhaps a microservice that speaks to a front end screen or whatever the case might be. What is your thoughts on that? Because it almost seems to be the first question that needs to be answered is not, are we going to have jobs, but what are those jobs going to be looking like in the interim as we move towards that end state?
Okay, I think that's a very good question, but I do see we're out of time. So if you... Okay, excellent. Okay, excellent. Okay, so a lot to unpack in your question. Yes, so what I presented is the ideal superhuman software engineer. My intent is not for any of us to ascend to that place. If you do, then you replace all of us. My idea is to make us aware that what we are doing now might not be longer enough, or might not be relevant enough. So yes, there is definitely a transition period. Many of the future technologies, if you remember, like AI is not yet a tool in every engineer's arsenal. But perhaps in that perspective, it's a good idea to start building up knowledge of it. Are we done? Okay.